You finally sat down. Not because you gave up, not because something went wrong. You were just done. Work was finished, dinner was over, nobody needed a ride anywhere. There was no email you had to answer, no appointment you were already late for, no small domestic emergency waiting patiently in another room. For once, the next hour didn't belong to anything. So you sat on the sofa, and for about 3 minutes, this felt excellent. Then something happened. You checked your phone, put it down, looked around the room, remembered that thing in the kitchen you could probably fix, thought about going for a walk, maybe answering that message, maybe watching something, maybe reading. Actually, you haven't exercised today, and there are a few things you could prepare for tomorrow. Nothing was urgent. That's the strange part. Nothing had changed. You had finally reached the empty piece of time you'd been waiting for all day, and almost immediately started looking for something to put inside it. And maybe you know the little sentence that appears around this point. I should probably do something. Which is a surprisingly interesting thing to think when 5 minutes earlier doing nothing was exactly what you wanted. Nobody said it to you. Your boss isn't hiding behind the sofa. There is no productivity inspector outside checking whether Tuesday evening has achieved its quarterly objectives. You're allowed to sit there. You know you're allowed to sit there. And yet, doing absolutely nothing can acquire this faint feeling of misuse. So we rename it. We're not lying on the sofa, we're recovering. We're not staring out the window, we're decompressing. We're not taking an aimless walk, we're getting our steps in. Apparently, inactivity becomes much easier to defend once it can provide supporting documentation. And that's the small thing I want to investigate here. Not why we're busy, not whether modern life is exhausting. Something stranger. Why does doing nothing sometimes start to feel like doing something wrong? This is Punchline Protocol, the human layer of Protocol Multiverse. Here, we start with the ordinary experience, the small things you notice in your own life before you necessarily know what they mean. Dark Side Protocol looks at the systems underneath those experiences. Debrief Protocol connects the layers and asks what becomes visible when you look at both together. Different perspectives. Same investigation. Here, we stay with the human part. The easiest solution, of course, is to do something useful. Not necessarily something important. That's a different category entirely. Important things require decisions. Useful things are wonderfully available. There's always a drawer that could be organized, an email that could be answered early, a dishwasher that technically doesn't need unloading until tomorrow, but has made the tactical mistake of existing within walking distance. You could check your bank account, update something, clean something, order something you've been meaning to order. Look up that thing you vaguely remember needing. And none of this is bad. That's what makes it interesting. These are perfectly reasonable things to do, but notice what happens the moment you choose one. The empty hour changes character. Now something happened in it. The kitchen is cleaner. The message is answered. Tomorrow is slightly easier. There is evidence, and somehow that can make the hour feel more legitimate than the exact same 60 minutes spent sitting outside with a cup of coffee watching absolutely nothing improve. Maybe usefulness gives free time something surprisingly comforting, a receipt. You can point to what happened, even if nobody asks. What did you do last night? Well, I sorted out the garage. I finally dealt with those emails. I went for a run. I meal prepped. I finished that thing. These answers have shape. Try answering, nothing, really. I sat around for a while. Perfectly legal. Weirdly difficult to say with the same confidence. And again, this isn't because useful evenings are secretly bad evenings. Sometimes sorting the garage genuinely needs doing, particularly if entering it currently requires mountaineering equipment. The interesting part is that usefulness doesn't only produce an outcome, it can also remove the tiny discomfort of having no outcome at all. The moment something gets accomplished, you no longer have to wonder whether the time was wasted. The activity didn't just use the hour, it gave the hour an alibi. And if usefulness makes empty time easier to justify, rest has an even better solution. It becomes useful too. We rarely seem to describe rest as something that simply happened anymore. We recharge, we recover, we reset, we decompress, we protect our energy. We take a mental health day so we can come back functioning properly. Even sleep has somehow acquired the atmosphere of scheduled maintenance. 8 hours isn't just 8 hours unconscious in a bed, it's an investment in tomorrow's cognitive performance. A quiet evening helps you perform better at work. A walk improves your health. Reading reduces stress. A holiday prevents burnout. A hobby keeps you balanced. Again, all of these things may be completely true. Rest really does have benefits, but notice how convenient those benefits are when we need permission to stop. The moment doing nothing can improve what happens later, it stops looking like nothing. Now it has an objective. It has measurable consequences. It has a respectable little arrow pointing toward the future. Apparently, even the sofa becomes easier to occupy once tomorrow has agreed to receive the return, which creates a slightly ridiculous possibility. Maybe we become better at permitting rest by turning rest into another form of work. Not work in the exhausting sense, work in the structural sense. It has a job now. Recovery prepares you. Sleep optimizes you. Leisure restores you. The weekend gets you ready for Monday. And suddenly the question isn't simply, did you enjoy being still? It's, did being still successfully improve your ability to stop being still later? That's an excellent arrangement for Monday. I'm less certain what Sunday gets out of it. Because if rest is legitimate mainly when it makes future activity possible, then even inactivity remains accountable to activity. You may be doing nothing right now, but fortunately, you've prepared a business case explaining how this nothing will increase output tomorrow. We didn't necessarily learn how to stop. We may have learned how to make stopping productive. And this gets easier to see when the empty hour becomes an entire day. A free Saturday sounds wonderful on Friday afternoon. No plans, no obligations, nothing you have to do. Then Saturday arrives, and by about 11 in the morning, the day has somehow developed performance expectations. You could go somewhere, see someone, get outside, finally visit that place you'd been talking about, cook something good, exercise, take the kids somewhere, work on the house, read, have a proper family day. At the very least, the weather is nice, which feels suspiciously like evidence that staying home would be wasting a limited resource. So even leisure begins producing its own strange pressure. The weekend should be well spent. The holiday should be made the most of. The evening shouldn't be wasted. And those phrases are interesting because they sound almost financial. Time arrives like a small budget, and apparently we're expected to show that we allocated it responsibly. Monday morning comes, somebody asks, "What did you do this weekend?" And honestly, not much can feel less like a description and more like a confession. Of course, sometimes we genuinely want the trip, the dinner, the museum, the long walk, the ambitious family expedition that begins with optimism and ends with somebody crying beside a motorway service station. Those experiences matter. The problem isn't that free time contains things. It's that an empty day can start feeling unsuccessful simply because it remained empty. We can finish a weekend rested and still feel that we somehow didn't use it properly. We can return from a holiday and immediately evaluate whether we saw enough, did enough, experienced enough, as if vacation came with an invisible completion bar and we accidentally returned home at 83%. Which suggests that the pressure isn't always to work. Sometimes the pressure is simply to make time count, to leave behind a memory, an achievement, a story, a cleaner house, a healthier body, a stronger relationship, something that can testify that those hours were not lost. Apparently, free time can be ours, and still feel like something we're responsible for spending correctly. Maybe that's why some kinds of free time feel easier to remember than others. A day trip leaves photographs. A run leaves distance. A book leaves pages finished. A project leaves something on the table that wasn't there before. Even a conversation can leave a story. But spend an afternoon moving slowly between the sofa, the kitchen, and a chair by the window, and the evidence becomes considerably less impressive. Nothing was completed. Nothing improved enough to mention. There may not even be a particularly good memory. You just existed for a few hours without converting the experience into anything durable. And afterward, this can create a strangely specific discomfort. I did absolutely nothing today. We say it as though the day arrived with potential and we failed to process it before closing time. Sometimes we even try to rescue the account. Well, I needed it. I've been exhausted. It was good to switch off. Tomorrow, I'll be more productive. Which may all be true. But notice how quickly we begin supplying evidence for the defense. Apparently, an afternoon can disappear peacefully and still find itself needing legal representation. And perhaps the difficult part isn't doing nothing. We're actually quite capable of that. We scroll, we sit, we wander around the house, we stare at things. We open the fridge without a clear strategic objective and occasionally return 5 minutes later in case its inventory has changed. The difficult part may be having nothing to show for the time afterward. Because once an experience leaves no output, no improvement, and no useful story, there's very little available to prove that the time mattered. Which is strange, because while you were inside those hours, they didn't necessarily feel meaningless. The coffee tasted good. The room was quiet. You watched the light move across the wall. Maybe you thought about nothing particularly important. Maybe nothing happened at all. The suspicion often arrives later, when the day is converted into an account of what you did with it, and suddenly an experience that was perfectly complete while it was happening can look strangely empty in retrospect. Maybe some time feels wasted only when we ask it to leave evidence behind. And the strange thing is that nobody has to enforce any of this. There doesn't need to be a manager standing in your living room asking why the last 47 minutes produced no measurable deliverables. Nobody sends a notification saying, "We've noticed unusually low levels of personal development this evening." Most of the time, nobody cares what you do with your free hour nearly as much as you do. And yet the supervision can continue perfectly well without external management. You sit down, and part of you starts scanning. Is there something I forgot? Something I could finish? Something useful I could do while I'm here? Should I exercise? Should I call someone? Should I at least watch that documentary I've been meaning to watch instead of this completely pointless thing I'm watching now? The remarkable part is how quickly freedom can generate its own checklist. The obligations leave the room, but apparently one employee stays behind to make sure the vacancy is being used efficiently. And maybe that's why the sentence, "I should probably do something," matters. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say, "I want to do something." It doesn't even necessarily say, "Something needs to be done." It says, "should." A tiny obligation appearing inside a space that was defined by the absence of obligation, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the pressure to use time well doesn't always need an external source anymore. Maybe after enough years of schedules, responsibilities, goals, deadlines, and things that genuinely do need doing, evaluation becomes portable. We carry it with us into the empty evening, into the weekend, into the holiday. Nobody has to ask what the time is for because some part of us has already opened the review process. And that's a peculiar kind of freedom. You were free from obligation. You just weren't free from evaluation. And maybe this is where the word free becomes interesting. Free time usually means time that hasn't already been claimed by work, appointments, errands, school runs, deadlines, or somebody else's immediate needs. It's the blank part of the calendar. But a blank calendar and a free experience are not necessarily the same thing. Because the moment those hours become available, they can immediately become a resource. Now you have 3 hours. You have an evening. You have a weekend. And once you have something limited, the obvious question is what you're going to do with it. Which is reasonable. Time is limited. There are things worth doing. But perhaps something subtle happens when every unclaimed hour is experienced primarily as available capacity. An empty evening stops being absence. It becomes inventory. Something you can allocate, invest, optimize, enjoy properly, recover during, make memories with, or accidentally waste. Even nothing becomes one possible use of the resource called time. And suddenly, the empty space isn't quite empty anymore. It's waiting for a decision, which may explain why doing nothing can feel uncomfortable even when nothing needs doing. The discomfort doesn't necessarily come from activity itself. It may come from unused possibility. You could be doing something. You could be improving something. You could be enjoying something more deliberately. You could be making better use of the only free evening you're going to get this week. And could has a remarkable ability to become should when the resource is scarce enough. A completely empty hour can begin to resemble an empty seat on a fully booked flight. Technically, nothing is wrong with it, but some part of you keeps thinking somebody should probably be using that. Maybe that's the deeper shift. Free time didn't disappear, it became capacity. And capacity has a peculiar problem. Once you can see it, leaving it unused starts looking like a decision. Of course, none of this means empty time is automatically good time. Sometimes doing nothing really is avoidance. Sometimes the dishes still need washing, the form still needs submitting, your body would probably benefit from moving, and the person you've been meaning to call may eventually notice that your communication strategy appears to be based on geological timescales. Time is finite. Responsibilities are real, and choosing to spend 2 hours doing absolutely nothing means those 2 hours cannot also be spent doing something else. That's not oppression. That's arithmetic. Every use of time excludes another use, including no use at all. So the point can't be that we should stop caring how we spend our lives. If anything, limited time gives those choices more weight. But perhaps that's exactly why a distinction matters here. Choosing what deserves your time is not the same thing as requiring every piece of time to deserve its existence. One is a decision about priorities. The other turns every empty hour into a small performance review. And there's another complication. Sometimes filling the empty hour genuinely makes life better. You go for the walk and you're glad you did. You call the friend and the conversation matters. You finally fix the shelf and experience the disproportionate satisfaction of living in a civilization where it is now approximately level. So, I should probably do something isn't automatically an enemy. Sometimes it's useful information. The question is, what happens when it becomes the default response to emptiness itself? When inactivity needs a reason before activity does? When sitting quietly requires an explanation but checking email somehow arrives pre-approved? Maybe freedom was never supposed to mean ignoring consequences or pretending time is infinite. Maybe it requires something more modest. The ability to make a trade-off without automatically treating the option that produces the least evidence as the losing one. Doing nothing has a cost, but so does living as though every unused minute is a loss. So maybe the strange thing isn't that we care about time. Of course we do. There isn't an unlimited supply, and eventually the phrase, "I'll get to it someday," begins competing with the inconvenient fact that someday has terrible scheduling discipline. The strange thing is how easily caring about time can become requiring time to justify itself. A good hour becomes an hour that produced something, or improved something, or restored something, or created a memory worth keeping. Even pleasure can qualify, provided we enjoyed ourselves sufficiently and preferably have photographs confirming that the experience occurred. But perhaps some hours don't need to become anything else. They don't need to improve tomorrow. They don't need to become a story. They don't need to teach you something, strengthen a relationship, restore your energy, or help you return on Monday as a more efficient version of yourself. Maybe an hour can pass, leave almost nothing behind, and still not have been stolen from your life. Maybe being alive during it was already enough participation. And I'm not suggesting you schedule 3 hours of purposeless staring between dinner and bedtime. The moment we turn this into another prescription, we'll probably invent a tracking app, establish a weekly target, and spend Sunday evening disappointed that we only achieved 72% of our intentional nothingness goal. That's exactly the trap. This isn't another thing to do correctly. It's just a distinction worth noticing. There are moments when your time needs a purpose. There are moments when consequences matter. There are moments when getting up and doing the thing is absolutely the right choice. And then, there may be moments when nothing is asking to be solved, improved, captured, or prepared for. If one of those arrives, perhaps it doesn't immediately need a job. Maybe free time isn't the time when nothing needs to be done. Maybe it's the time that doesn't need to prove it was well spent. If this felt familiar, you probably don't need to turn doing nothing into a new personal development project. That would be a fairly efficient way to miss the point. There's no recommended number of empty hours per week, no ideal ratio between productive time and completely unjustifiable staring, and no reason to feel guilty if you genuinely enjoy filling every available minute. This isn't really about doing more nothing. It's about noticing the strange little moment when an empty piece of time arrives and immediately seems to owe you an explanation. Because once you notice that moment, the question changes. Instead of asking whether you used the time well enough, you can at least notice who decided that the time was being evaluated in the first place. If that's your kind of investigation, stay around. There are plenty of ordinary things left to make strange. So no homework, no mandatory rest, no challenge to spend next Saturday heroically achieving absolutely nothing. Just the next time you finally sit down and hear that familiar sentence, I should probably do something. Maybe notice whether something actually needs doing, or whether an empty hour simply appeared and your internal supervisor reported for duty. Sometimes getting up will be the right answer. Sometimes the hour really does have consequences. And sometimes there may be nothing to fix at all. You don't have to prove that every hour was well spent in order to have spent a life inside it. The ideas are human. The narration is digital. The interpretation has always been yours.